Okay, we will get started here in a few minutes. We'll give folks a few more minutes to hop on, just a couple more minutes, and then we will get started. If you have any issues with sound or anything like that, just raise your hand and then I'll unmute you and then we'll figure out what's going on. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, if you have any issues with hearing me, just go ahead and raise your hand and I believe I'll get a notification. You can also just email me and I'll check that as well. So just to start, obviously everyone is on mute and then you can turn off your camera if you would like. So this presentation is going to be recorded. We have a few attorneys who were not able to make it, so we just wanted to record it so that we can provide this for later information. Please hold any questions that you have for the end, obviously unless you have questions about the audio or anything like that. And then when we get to the question portion, you can raise your hand at the bottom of your screen. You'll see that there's a little hand button, and then I'll go ahead and unmute you so that you can ask your question. So we'll just jump right in. Thank you all so much for being on here and being willing to spend time with us. We love building relationships with local legal professionals. So this is a great opportunity for us and to just share some information that we've been gathering, just make life a lot easier for any service providers for victims of domestic violence. So we'll jump into effectively representing survivors of domestic violence. So this is kind of our overview. We're going to discuss Domestic Violence 101. So that's kind of the basics of domestic violence and what's just the foundation so that we know kind of what we're talking about when we're referring to domestic violence. And then we're going to talk about trauma because that's really key, another foundational groundwork. And what is trauma-informed care? That's kind of the point of this training, is implementing trauma-informed care into legal services as much as we can. And then we have identified some survivor needs that we think just come up when we're working with our legal advocacy clients that we think would be helpful to go over just for when you are working with clients on a case that will make their lives easier and more supported and your lives easier as the professional working with them. And then obviously we'll go into those specific techniques that we've identified to help you work effectively with survivors of domestic violence. And finally, we'll just briefly review our role as the crisis center and what we do so that you can provide referrals if needed, and we can just make connections as we go. I'm going to check just one time, make sure I don't have any notifications. Awesome. Okay. So we'll go over kind of the basics of domestic violence, like I said. But first, the best way to start, I think, is the power and control wheel. Some of you may have seen this before. So a lot of people think domestic violence is just physical or sexual abuse. So it's like a broken arm or a black eye or something like that. But really, there's so many other smaller pieces in it. And that's why a group of women identified this. I think this came out in like the 80s. So they identified that there are often other tactics that accompany the violent incidences. So that's why it can be hard for some people to understand, oh, well, you don't have a black eye, you're not a victim of domestic violence, which is really traumatizing to hear when your abuser has already been invalidating your experience. So we can look at these kind of individually just briefly, but basically each of these tactics are used to help the abusive partner maintain control over their victim, essentially. So they may use intimidation. That can look like just a scary look, or look like getting really close to the victim's face and yelling and screaming at them, even destroying their property or throwing items around the room. That is intimidation. We have emotional abuse, so putting their partner down, making them feel bad about themselves, making fun of them or humiliating them in front of other people. That just tears down the victim's self esteem. We have using isolation, so maybe moving them away from family. We see that as really common. I have clients who, are from out of state and can't file for custody, but they just moved here with their partner and they don't have any family support here. They may tell them to not hang out with friends or family that they don't like. We have minimizing, denying, and blaming. This is very, very common. So, victim blaming that starts with the abusive partner. So, the perpetrator will tell them the abuse is their fault or say, I didn't hit you that hard. That's really a key piece. Using children. So, obviously, we've all probably heard of when the abuser says, you're never going to see our kids again if you leave me or file for divorce. Maybe they're manipulating and using parental alienation is very common and tricky. That's a big one. Using male privilege. Obviously, domestic violence is present in same sex relationships, but typically, when we're looking at heterosexual relationships, male privilege is something that is commonly used. So, saying that the female victim, doesn't have a right to make decisions or treating her like a servant, that is something that an abusive partner will use. Using economic abuse. So this really does come into play when working with in the legal realm of things. So maybe their abusive partner is racking up a bunch of debt in their name or not letting them have access to pay their basic bills. And then, of course, they can't afford an attorney. So economic abuse is something that's more covert, but it is something that is very, very common. And then, of course, using coercion or threats. So telling them that they're going to kill them or making them do things, do illegal things. Um, that is one of all of these that abusive partners use to maintain that power and control. And so these smaller incidences or dynamics really contribute to a chronic experience of trauma, which we'll talk about when we get into the trauma section. And then we have the cycle of abuse. So I like to use this as a really basic form of explanation for people who ask, like, why does she stay? Why did they stay? Why did they go back to their abusive partner when they know they're abusive? So these phases can really answer some of those questions. They may sound not like ignorant questions, but they are common, and sometimes it is hard to understand why a victim would go back to their partner or stay with them. But we have the tension building phase, and all of this has come from research that has been done on domestic violence, and the researchers have found that it progresses in these phases, typically. Not always, but majority of the time it does. There's the tension building phase, which I describe to clients as walking on eggshells. Maybe they're trying to avoid setting their perpetrator off. They're doing things to make sure that they don't get mad. There's a breakdown of communication, and there's a lot of tension in the relationship or in the home. And eventually, that tension does lead to the actual incident. Now, this can be not just physical, but emotional, verbal, a lot of anger, threats, intimidation. It's going to go from that tension to the incident. And then from the incident leads into stages 3 and 4, which really people typically don't understand. And these answer those questions of why do they stay? Obviously, there's other elements like children, lack of money, lack of family support. But these two help us understand how victims can still care for their partners. So obviously, it's a person they love. And then when you go from the abusive incident to the reconciliation, the victim may see that their partner is not that abusive or something like that. So their abuser apologizes, they may give them gifts, give excuses. Oftentimes, I've experienced where victims experience their perpetrator blaming them for the abuse and saying, well, if you hadn't done A, B, and C, I wouldn't have hit you or done this or taken the money away. So that reconciliation it's really the perpetrator trying to maintain control after they've had the incident, to keep the victim from leaving. And then obviously that calm phase plays into it, where sometimes the incidents come in waves where it's every 3 to 4 weeks. But in between, there's calm, and this is where the victim sees the good side of their perpetrator. And so that is why they stay, because they have hope. The perpetrator manipulates them into having hope. So stage 4 is really key in understanding those pieces. And then, of course, it goes back into that tension building phase, and it's just a constant cycle. So, what is trauma? It's a word that's used a lot now. People are talking about it in popular culture, and it's just kind of everywhere. It's important for us to actually understand what it means, though, so that we can provide services that are sensitive to trauma, and helps us have a more empathetic response to victims of domestic violence. I'll just read this definition verbatim, just because it's a really good definition. So, trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically and mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So the key is to remember from that long definition, there's been a traumatic event that's happened to the person, no matter what degree it is, and it has a lasting adverse effect on how the client copes, how they interact with the rest of the world. So with that piece, you have triggers. These are events or situations that can symbolize past trauma. And this can look like sounds, smells, objects, significant life events. When we're thinking about working with victims of domestic violence, maybe they smell someone's perfume or cologne in your firm office, and that smells like their perpetrator, and then you notice they're starting to get agitated. That could be why. Maybe they hear a door slam in court or something like that, and it triggers them back to feeling like they're, on the verge of an abusive incident being perpetrated by their partner. So triggers really are something that we look at when it comes to providing trauma-informed services, avoiding triggers, and doing the best that we can to provide empathetic responses when a client is triggered. Psychological trauma is something that really is key when you're working with victims, especially in the legal side of things, because that's psychologically traumatic in itself. Obviously, not to that same degree, but it's stressful. So add that layer of normal stress that client has going into court, and then add the domestic violence that they've experienced, that chronic experience, and they can feel intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, threat of annihilation. And we'll go into more detail about what this looks like in different interactions with clients. But the psychological trauma piece is really important to recognize that it is playing a role in how your client is interacting with you and the rest of the world. So really, trauma can impact, from DV, can impact every area of a survivor's life, even if they have already separated from their partner. And this is why trauma-informed care is key when you are a service provider for a client. So, like I said, we kind of identified 3 main areas when it comes to clients working in the legal realm of things where they can have trauma reactions. That's in meetings, in making decisions, and in court. In meetings, sometimes we as legal advocates will go to a meeting with a client if they give us permission to and they just need extra support. So I have noticed before that some clients, when they have a particularly traumatic story, will retell their story multiple times to their attorney. Now, obviously, it's important to set boundaries, and we'll talk about that later, and remind them that you're not their therapist in a more gentle way. But they'll often retell their story multiple times because they're still processing their trauma, especially if it's fresh. Like maybe it's just their consultation or their second or third meeting with you, and you've heard the same story. Sometimes they just need that validation, and they're trying to process it verbally to understand what's going on. And maybe they're even trying to justify why they're asking for full custody or why they're leaving their partner. So that's a common one we see in meetings with attorneys. Often, some clients will ask the same question multiple times, which even I can get frustrated with. So I'm sure that attorneys get frustrated with it as well. You might give the same answer 16 different times, but it's important to realize that first, in some cases, trauma can impact memory. So maybe the client genuinely just forgot. They're not trying to be lazy or not paying attention to you. It could just be the result of their trauma, and maybe they're looking for a different answer. Sometimes clients do ask the same question at different times, hoping for a different answer, just because their life feels so out of control. So they might ask, and they're coming to you as an attorney for answers, and typically they're looking for answers that they want to hear, not the true answers. And then emotional escalation can happen when they receive negative news from an attorney. So maybe you're telling them, you're not going to get full custody, or your perpetrator didn't take our offer on this, or something like that. They might escalate, and it might feel like they're getting angry at you and putting the blame on you. But really, maybe they're being triggered and having a fear of, well, this is what my perpetrator said would happen, and now it's happening. So they're feeling upset, they're feeling triggered and anxious about the outcome of the negative news that you're delivering. It's kind of that don't shoot the messenger kind of concept. So it's important to realize that that's a piece in interacting with clients in meetings. And then in making decisions, so sometimes a lot of clients will experience inability to or fear of making decisions, or making progress on paperwork. So sometimes a client will not respond to you for 2 weeks, respond to your email for 2 weeks. This could be just because they're dealing with a lot. Maybe they lost their housing. Maybe they are safety planning with their advocates. So that can present itself, and it can also be just from what I communicate to my clients is when they're leaving a partner, they're grieving the loss of a relationship. They're grieving the loss of something that was important to them. So maybe making progress on paperwork really feels like another step towards the end, and that's really scary for them. So patience is key in this phase, and like I keep saying, we'll talk about that more in depth in the technique section. But making progress on paperwork, sometimes clients struggle with that because they're feeling overwhelmed or because they're afraid of what's on the other side at the end of this case. And then kind of back into that multiple questions piece, sometimes in making decisions, they want to know all possible outcomes of a decision. So they might ask you again and again, like, what could happen? What happens if I do A? What happens if I do B? What happens if I do C? That's part of the planning piece, which I understand as an anxious person. But for victims, it's really about understanding the consequences of their actions, partly because their brain has been trained that way by their perpetrator to think that I need to know what the consequences of my actions are going to be so I can prepare, or my decisions are going to be so that I can prepare for what the response, the outcome is going to be. So they might ask you a lot of questions about custody, and so that it can get frustrating, but that is part of their chronic experience of trauma and the way that their perpetrator has trained their brain to think. And with that, they've also been in a relationship where they probably aren't allowed to make a lot of decisions. So they really go to you for answers, because they don't know the answers, and they need that support of knowing how to make a decision and what decision is going to be best for them. And then in court, which is pretty obvious, you have some clients who will cry, will shut down, get angry, not know how to answer a question. And this is understandable for anyone who's going to court. It's an intimidating process, as I'm sure you all know, but add the layer of trauma on top of that, and the client, especially if they have to see their perpetrator in court and it's an immediate trigger. It's important to pay attention and see if their perpetrator is giving them dirty looks across the courtroom and addressing that. Um, the intimidation factor still happens in court, whether we like it or not. And so these reactions are normal, and it's important to prepare your client for that before you go in, whether that's the day of or a few days before, and saying it's okay if you get upset. This is what you can do. Here's a stress ball. That's what I do with my clients when we're prepping for court. And then sometimes they will express frustration about not being able to talk about the abuse in court. Obviously, this varies case by case, but I have had clients before who feel really invalidated when they can't go into detail about what their perpetrator has done, how much they've ruined their lives, and the trauma they've created. Like I said, sometimes you can talk about this, but a lot of times you can't because you're focused on getting other things resolved. And so the client has already spent however many months, years, days, whatever, with their perpetrator, and so they might express frustration about not being able to share their trauma and their experience because they've already been so invalidated by their partner up until this point. So it feels kind of just like another load on top of them when they can't tell the judge exactly step by step what has happened to them up until this point and why it justifies what they're asking for. And then again, that extreme anxiety piece can really impact how they testify, how they answer your questions, and their responses in court. So, trauma informed care. I kind of went over this a little bit briefly, but trauma informed care really is the process of recognizing the presence and the role of trauma in a client's life, and then moving forward from that and providing services that are empathetic, supportive, and understanding of their experience. So, I think the best kind of brief way to sum it up is trauma informed care is the mentality of shifting your mentality from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So even I can still get tripped up on this when I have clients who, are frustrated at me because I'm not giving them the answers they want, and then I want to respond defensively. But then my trauma informed brain kicks in, thinking, okay, they're not mad at me, they're mad at the legal system, the situation, other services they've received from other agencies, maybe. So, and then of course, they're also responding out of trauma created by their partner. Maybe I did something that triggered them or made a certain movement, or maybe I said something that reminded them of what their partner said. So it's really important to consciously avoid re traumatization when you are working with survivors of domestic violence. That is kind of, in a nutshell, what trauma informed care is. Now, this looks really different depending on your role in working with a client, but there's some basic needs and techniques that one can use to implement trauma informed care on a daily basis. And obviously, it's going to change by the survivor and their story, but there are some basics that you can kind of implement when it comes to working with any survivor that will help you be empathetic, help them feel empowered and understood and validated. That's really key, and that's kind of the point of this whole presentation is trauma informed care. These are the kind of basic needs we've identified that are a lot of our legal clients and even non-legal clients need when it comes to being a service provider for them, and especially working on legal things with them. So clear, and we'll kind of go in depth in each of these, but these are just like the general outlines of them. So clear and open communication. Clients get frustrated when they don't hear back from their attorney in 2 weeks, which is understandable because attorneys have lives. But communicating, hey, I will respond back to you on this date, can just relieve their stress and their trust, because sometimes it's a trigger because their partner has ignored them before when they needed something or refuses to talk to them when they've done something wrong. The clear and open communication just makes both of your lives a whole lot easier when it comes to making progress on a case. Honesty about their case and potential outcomes. We talked about this a little bit previously. The clients really, it varies, so you're going to have to gauge it. But some clients really, really want to know, like, be honest, be blunt with me, and tell me the potential outcomes of if I ask for this or make this decision or say this in mediation, you know. So this is one that you have to gauge, but giving them that honesty about their case builds the trust between you and the client and the victim, um, and it empowers them to, you know, feel more confident when they make a decision because they know what the outcome is going to be. It doesn't feel like everything is up in the air like everything else in the rest of their life. Empathy and understanding when they are having a trauma response. So, this, like I said, it can be really easy to get defensive, especially with clients who are acting aggressively. Obviously, if they're acting too aggressive, it's okay to say, like, this isn't appropriate, let's talk at a later time. But if they're having, you know, extreme anxiety or crying, not invalidating their feelings, or I don't think anyone would really say this, but I wouldn't be surprised um, if someone said, like, you're overreacting or you don't stop crying right now. Those are kind of extreme examples, but approaching the client with empathy, you don't have to say, like, I understand what you're going through, but just saying, I hear you. And this has got to be frustrating, really just provides the extra level of support that they need. Um, Even though you're just an attorney, it still is extremely impactful in the long run for the client. And then they do need often reminders that they know what is best for them. I would say 80% of my job as a legal advocate, since I can't give legal advice, is just sitting with clients and saying, like, that is sucks. That really sucks. It's This is a frustrating process, and I fully understand that. So when I don't have a better answer for them, I'll just you know, remind them, like, you know what's best for you. This process sucks. I'm validating your feelings, and I'm validating and reminding you that you know the best steps to take to move forward, and that you are doing what's best for you, for your family, for your children, for your safety. So that really is part of that empowerment piece. This ties back into, like, the honesty about their case and open communication, but really an overview of exactly what is going to happen at court or mediation um, eases a lot of anxiety for clients because they're already going into it, sometimes knowing they're going to have to face their perpetrator. So that's like a base level of, like, anxiety that they're dealing with. So add on top of that, not knowing how to dress, where to go, what courtroom is it, what even is mediation, like, what's my role in that. Um, Providing that overview of exactly what is going to happen, or even saying, go, you know, process with your legal advocate about what's going to happen in court. That's fine too if you don't have time to do that. Um, that's what we're here for, is to provide that procedural support and relieve the stress and the that comes with the uncertainty of court. Communication about the role they play in the process, and that's kind of that overview. That is another huge part of empowerment, is telling the client, okay, I, as your attorney, do A, B, and C for you. You're going to do, you know, this part of A, this part of C, this part of D. I need you to gather this financial information. Really telling them that they're, like, partnering with them in the process, so that they feel like they are gaining some of that control back over their lives. Because I think a lot of times when clients are working with attorneys, they can feel like their life is out of their hands. It's already in the hands of the court, and then they may not know what's going on with their case because their attorney isn't partnering with them. So communicating about the role they play in the process, whether that's just saying, I just need you to sit back right now and I'll handle this, that's even fine too. And then clarity about fees and billing. This is something that we have run into as an issue a lot. Some clients struggle with. They might get frustrated or even drop an attorney. Obviously, there's some financial hardship to it. Sometimes they feel like they can't trust their attorney if they feel like a bill has been sprung on them. And obviously, we remind them, like, they're running a business. It's important to realize that. But clarity, which we'll talk about really in depth in the next slide, is going to be helpful. And again, building that trust piece between the legal professional and the survivor. So we're on our techniques phase. Really, one of the biggest challenges, like I said, is clients have a hard time understanding expectations about attorney fees. So a lot of our clients can't afford to, pay $5,000 for a retainer, so they'll borrow money from family or pay it on a credit card. And they often misunderstand how billing works, when payments due, whether that's a breakdown of communication on either side, the attorney or the client. This is something that we find is really common, and it can be a trigger for some clients because maybe their, attorney said, I literally can't do more work for you unless you pay me this amount of money. That can be triggering for some clients because maybe their partner said, no, I'm not doing anything for you. I'm not giving you any money until you do this for me, until you stop acting like this. So whether you unintentionally said that or not, no, it can be a trigger if it is expressed a certain way, for clients to hear that their attorney can't do any more work on their case until they make a payment, which is an understandable expectation. No, it can be a trigger, and so kind of identify the best way to approach it based on the client and their story. Um, some ways that we think might improve communication with survivors based on what we know about trauma and their understanding of the legal process. Providing that clarity from the consultation and point of hire about fees, about your retainer, about what is going to happen when the retainer is up. That clarity from the beginning, and then frequent reminders about balances, amounts owed, and due dates is just going to kind of give the client a roadmap to making it through this case and making their payments. And it's going to relieve some anxiety, and that's what you can do to be trauma informed is, be clear, be open, be honest, and just being supportive in that sense. So these are kind of just some more general techniques that we think can be really helpful when working with survivors, especially on legal matters. So emphasizing the client's strengths, that ties back into that piece that I was talking about of telling the client that they know what's best for them. So emphasizing their strengths can be as small as saying, you did a really good job on getting me this paperwork on time, or filling out your sworn financial statement, or I've noticed during our hearing that you've been really, really strong. You don't, obviously, this isn't required in the attorney client relationship, but it's something that gives you a greater role and makes you a part of their healing process, because they've been torn down so much at this point. They don't need, on top of that, to deal with an attorney who's cold or who isn't any kind of empathetic or understanding of what they're going through. And so building up the client's strengths, emphasizing their strengths, will build up their self-esteem, make them more confident in court for you, and make them feel like they can make it through this case. Focusing on trust and safety. So trust-wise, that is that clear and open communication piece, making sure that you are communicating with the client honestly, so that they don't feel like you're going behind their back by talking to the other person's attorney, which obviously happens, but saying, hey, I'm talking to their attorney so we can talk about this. I'm on your side if they start to feel triggered. And then a safety piece that a lot of people don't think about is creating a trauma-informed kind of office space. So obviously it's safety in the sense of having court security present in court if the client needs it, so that they feel more comfortable. But it can also look like, having better lighting in your office, having plants around, asking the client if they want any water or anything like that. That will reduce the levels of anxiety, make it easier for you to communicate with the client, and to just improve the relationship in general, because they know that you are a safe person and this is a safe environment for them. It's really, really helpful to focus on the individual and the context of their life experience and trauma. Obviously, we went over the basics of domestic violence with the power and control wheel and the cycle of domestic violence. But really, every person has a story that's different. Everyone's trauma looks different. Everyone's experience of abuse looks different. So focusing on that individual and maybe getting a general overview of their trauma story if they want to share it from the beginning, and then focusing on the context of that trauma and their life experience will help you kind of navigate, okay, I need to operate this way with this client, but I need to be kind of more kind with this client, but I can be pretty blunt and honest with this other client. So it's really varies by case, but focusing on that individual context of trauma um, is just going to improve how you interact with victims. Validating frustrations, like I said, just sitting there and saying, this sucked. Sometimes, obviously, you're there to provide answers and to get a job done. But if it seems like everything you're saying isn't satisfying a client, sometimes they genuinely just need to hear, this sucked, or this is frustrating, and I hate that we can't change this. Sometimes that's all they need to hear. They'll process it and then move forward from there. Partnering with the client to resolve the case to minimize the power imbalance. So that's that piece that I was talking about. They've been in a relationship with an abuser who has taken all power away from them. They feel like they have no control over anything because their partner has said that they have no control. And so if they leave their partner and then get into a professional relationship with an attorney who bosses them around, tells them that what they're saying doesn't matter, it's irrelevant, that's automatically, understandably, a trigger. That's going to create mistrust. It's going to create frustration and tension in the relationship, whether you realize it or not. So partnering with the client and saying that piece that I was saying of, this is what you're going to be working on, this is what I'm going to be working on. Even saying, I need you to work on going to therapy while I work on your financial information, can really just empower the client and again makes you a pivotal piece of their healing process. And then respecting the client's choices. So obviously attorneys and legal professionals give legal advice, and it's still okay to say to a client, I don't advise that you do that. But at the same time, we have had some um, clients who have experiences with attorneys who tell them they're making a bad decision, or they're, crazy or overreacting, or it's, the client goes against what the attorney says that they should do. Respecting their choices looks like saying, I'm advising you to do this, but I understand you're doing what's best for you, and this is how I can support you moving forward based on that decision you're making, because they're in new territory of making decisions for themselves. And so you don't want to be a trigger and make them feel like they're unable to make choices for themselves. And our last slide on techniques. So it is okay and important, super, super important as an attorney, to set boundaries around your role and client expectations. And this ties into that last bullet point of providing referrals when needed. So, like we were talking about earlier, sometimes a client might process their trauma with you over and over and over again. Maybe you ask them like a technical legal question, and they go into a story about the abuse they've experienced. It's okay to stop a client kindly and tell them, hey, are you in therapy? Let's look at this list of referrals from the crisis center. Let me give you the crisis line number that you can call them and get connected with the therapist, and saying, I want you to be able to process this with someone whose job it is to process it, because you deserve that. So setting boundaries around your role, that you're not their therapist, you're not their advocate, and saying specifically, this is what my job is, will just make it easier down the line operating in the case. And then listening to their stories to identify possible triggers, which we kind of talked about briefly. So maybe upon their intake or the consultation, you can get a general timeline or idea of what the relationship looked like. That will help you with trauma-informed care in your office, in meetings, in email or phone call communications, and then in court. Obviously, it's not your responsibility to navigate through all of those nuances, but it can just make your life easier, and it can just improve interactions with the client. So, like I was saying earlier, if they become aggressive towards you, you can say, oh, they're feeling triggered because I said this, and this is what their perpetrator used to say to them. Listening to their stories ties into that empathy piece, validation, and just making it a trauma-informed environment. And then just remembering reactions can be related to trauma. Not going into defensive mode isn't a normal case where it's just, if it's a divorce, it's just a couple that marriage is broken. There is DV involved. There is that piece. And so remember that, give them the benefit of the doubt at first and saying, they're acting aggressively because of this, or they're acting anxious or emotional because of this. That trauma piece is important to remember, and it will just kind of reduce your anxiety when working with the client as well. That's kind of all we have for our general information on working with clients. If you have any questions, obviously we're going to have our question portion at the end, but we just really thought that was really helpful basic information for legal professionals, because we know so many of you are working with our clients and just victims of domestic violence in general. And so remembering these kinds of techniques can just make your life easier, our life easier, and support healing for the client. Yeah, we'll just go over the crisis center services, which some of you know about, some of you don't. But we do provide completely free services for victims of domestic violence in the 18th Judicial District. We have our community advocacy program, and that is where a client who is in need of it will be connected with a community advocate, and they'll work for 10 weeks or so, meeting a few hours a week. And the community advocate can really travel to wherever the client is, as long as it's in the 18th, provide that, trauma-informed services. And they'll work on things from resume building to hunting for jobs, to applying for TANF, really building up that foundation for clients who are about to leave, have left, or are still dealing with the residual effects of a domestic violence relationship. And then, of course, our legal advocacy program, which I've talked about briefly throughout this presentation. We have 2 legal advocates, it's myself and Susanna Thompson. We do have an office at the Douglas County Courthouse. We are here now 2 days a week, well, 4 total, with COVID restrictions, obviously, but we can go to court with clients, provide emotional support. We can help them. Obviously, we can't give legal advice, and we remind clients that we're not attorneys, but we do help them procedurally, kind of like a self-help center of getting the right paperwork, getting connected to attorneys, providing referrals, and understanding the legal process, which is why I said, if you feel overwhelmed with explaining, the nuances of what a court hearing looks like, you can send them to us and we can answer their general questions and be that extra level of support when it comes to resolving their legal issues. And then we do have therapy that's completely free. We currently have 2 therapists on staff and are working on getting more. Our wait list is full at this point, but we have therapy for adults, for kids, and then at times we do have some group therapy as well. And then even when our wait list is full, clients can still call our crisis line and we can provide them with a list of local referrals that might be helpful for them. We do have our emergency shelter. Obviously, we're at reduced capacity right now because of COVID, but typically, normally, we have 7 beds. We can fit a family of 4 or 2 individuals, or a male in 1 room. And we can serve with our shelter, which is a 21-day stay, anyone in Colorado, and even clients coming from out of state or victims coming from out of state. It's not restricted to the 18th Judicial District. And when they are staying at our emergency shelter, like I said, it's a 21-day stay. They have access to therapy and to community advocacy. And it's a confidential shelter, so it is for clients who are in imminent danger and believe that they could be harmed by their partner or being followed by their partner. And then finally, we have our 24/7 crisis line. So that number is right there if you want to write it down. It's something that's really good to give to clients. Always manned by one of us 24/7. They can call to just process some of their emotions, to process their frustrations, to safety plan, to get access to our emergency shelter or to our other program. So that is a really, really handy number to have if you need to provide it for clients. And then we do, and one that I forgot to go over, we have our lethality assessment program, which I'll kind of talk about with the coverage volunteer opportunity. So some of you may know, but we have our lethality assessment program. It's an evidence-based program that we have brought to Colorado. And when officers in the 18th Judicial District go out on a domestic call, they're supposed to ask the victim a series of questions. So questions like, do you think your partner would kill you? Have they threatened to kill you? Is your partner unemployed? And if they say yes or no to a certain number of questions, then the client, or certain questions, then they will screen in as in a highly lethal situation. And we get connected to them. And when they go to court the next day at the Douglas County Courthouse, then we meet with them, go over safety planning, communicate people in their situation before them in the past who've answered yes to those questions have been killed before. And so we want to make sure that they have the right resources and safety plan in place. So that coverage happens. We meet with clients during the week from 8 to 10 a.m. before they go to court. And so sometimes we need coverage for that as well as a volunteer opportunity. Right now, it's not in effect, obviously, because of COVID, but when it does happen, we may need coverage for that in the future if anyone is interested. Other opportunities that we just wanted to present that you can be aware of and other people can be aware of is administrative work. So working at our confidential shelter in Highlands Ranch, just answering our admin phone, opening the door for clients, stuff like that. Childcare, always a plus, especially for the legal team. Sometimes we have clients who don't have childcare and have nowhere to put their child when they're going to court, because obviously kids aren't allowed in court. So we have volunteers who provide childcare. Crisis line coverage, so after being trained, sometimes we need people to just answer the phone when an advocate's on break and things like that. Outreach and event assistance. We have our gala coming up I think it's in November. If you want more information on that, please just let me know and I'll get you connected with that. Sometimes we need help with our events and then outreach, providing presentations like this. And legal advocacy, I have to do a plug for that. Volunteering at legal clinics that we may have in the future. Sometimes we have clients who just want to talk to an attorney. So that is an opportunity. And then any pro bono representation is always super helpful and always needed with our clients. That's kind of all that I have. We have about 15 more minutes. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to use that raise hand button at the bottom, and then I'll unmute you and then we can kind of talk about what you have a question on. I'll give us a couple minutes if anyone wants to raise their hands. Let's see. Okay, Tony, move. Okay, awesome. Can you hear me? Oh, let me unmute you. Okay, I think you're okay. There you go.
Oh, there you go. Sorry. So, and I think everyone on this call, thank you for delivering this for us. I think we're all from Metro Volunteer Lawyers. Your other two participants are Liz and Anne. So thank you for doing this for us. I had a couple of questions, and some of you may have already talked with Anne about. Is there a way for us to be more involved with you? I mean, we are, we serve your district. So that's the first question. The second was, can you send us something about what you do have in existence right now as far as in COVID times, what services are specifically available right now? And then third, you talked a lot about the Douglas County Courthouse. Do you help with Albert or in Arapahoe?
Yeah, so we do help in Arapahoe, and then we do have an office in Albert, so Suzanne usually goes out there. So if any clients out in those areas or counties are needing assistance, we can help out there. So our office is in Douglas, but we do go out to Arapahoe and Albert as well. And then as far as involvement, we have already been connected with Anne, who's super awesome, and I'm so glad all of you were able to attend this. So really, I can talk to my supervisor about it, but we have talked about having like legal clinics before. We just need to, it's hard to gauge client interest, especially right now with COVID. But we would love to have any attorneys who can help with legal clinics, or even just if we can have more contact. Sometimes we just have clients who just have a general legal question that we as advocates don't know the answer to, and so we don't know where to send them. So even if we can just have more contact with you guys just to answer general questions, would be super helpful. And then what was your second question? Sorry, I was about to write it down.
If you could just send us a list of like what you had during COVID as active resources for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send you pretty much all of our services are active right now. We're just operating a little bit differently with masks and everything like that. But I'll send you that list, and then we can always, if you have any questions as things progress, you can always call our admin or crisis line, or even just email me directly.
Well, thanks, Marissa. Like I said, on behalf of all of us, thanks for help letting us do this. And Anne, I'll leave you in Anne's capable hands. She definitely knows, everything about what we're doing. So, but thanks again for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you all three of you for being on here. It helps to just get the information out to people.
Oh, absolutely. So good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Awesome.
It looks like Anne's raised her hand too.
There we go. I think I unmuted you, Anne.
I think so. There we go. I don't actually have a question. I just wanted to say thank you so much. The information was so valuable, particularly bringing up the aspect of how it can be very difficult for someone to complete paperwork. That's something that I run into often and fail to recognize the connection. So I just want to say thank you so much. So that was very, very helpful.
Absolutely. I'm so glad it was helpful. We know that these are like things that it's easy to not think about. And so we just want to make your jobs easier because we understand how tough it can be to work with survivors. So thanks for being receptive to it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, if there's, Tony, do you have another question?
I don't.
Okay, awesome. I just lowered your hand. Perfect. Well, if there's no other questions, we're just about almost at our hour. I'll send out this recording in case you know of any other colleagues or anyone who might be interested in it. And then if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And then our crisis line is in my email signature as well. Then I'll also be sending just a quick survey, like on SurveyMonkey, just to get a gauge on how you guys felt about the presentation and see if we need to do it more or cover more information.
Marissa, I do have a question. We have a website that we're kind of working on and building on as far as resources. Is this something we could post with your permission to that website?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me confirm it with my supervisor, but I'm sure that she'll be fine with that. So I'll ask her today, and then I can email you, Tony, if that works.
Perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, so I will do that. And if no one has anything else, I will end our session.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Everyone have a good day.
You too.